In California, the cannabis equity businesses can now request a license fee waiver from the Department of Cannabis Control. The cannabis business must meet the following criteria. First, equity ownership. Individuals who meet the equity criteria own 50% or more of the business. Number two, gross revenues. The business has gross revenue of 1.5 million or less per year. If a new applicant, the business expects gross revenue of 1.5 million or less for the first year. Equity owners must meet at least one of the following criteria. Number one, cannabis conviction or arrest. The owner was convicted of or arrested for a cannabis offense before November 8th, 2016. Number two, household income. The owner's household income is less than or equal to 60% of the area median income for the local jurisdiction where they live. Number three, neighborhood. The owner lived for at least 5 years between 1980 and 2016 in an area disproportionately impacted by past criminal justice policies implementing cannabis prohibition. Learn more about qualifying neighborhoods or use our map tool to see if you lived in a qualifying area. If you participate in your local jurisdiction's equity program, you can show you meet the equity criteria through an attestation on the fee waiver form. If you don't participate in your local equity program or are in a jurisdiction without an equity program, you can submit documents to show your eligibility. California Governor Gavin Newsom aims for cannabis compliance education in budget plan. As 2022 budget plans continue to roll out, California is the latest to put cannabis tax revenue towards strengthening cannabis regulations. Governor Gavin Newsom released his 2022 to 2023 budget plan on January 10th. It allocates $13.6 million from the Cannabis Tax Fund to the Department of Cannabis Control to continue tackling major goals, from licensing to the unregulated market. This includes $6.1 million towards a multi-year consumer education and awareness campaign, because a, quote, key tenet of the cannabis framework is consumer safety and awareness, end quote. A total of $5.5 million has been allocated towards the creation of a unified licensing system to, quote, continue simplifying and streamlining participation in the legal market and collect, analyze, and share licensing related data to support the administration of cannabis requirements, end quote. And the remaining $2 million in funding is also allocated for a data warehouse to store the state's regulated cannabis data. In addition, according to the governor's proposal, he, quote, supports cannabis tax reform and plans to work with the legislator to make modifications to California's cannabis tax policy to help stabilize the market, end quote. In Nevada, there was an advisory bulletin of notice of hearing for proposed amendments to NCCR. The Nevada Cannabis Compliance Board, CCB, will hold a public hearing for the purpose of considering the proposed adoption, amendment, or repeal of the Nevada Cannabis Compliance Regulations pertaining to 1.082, 1.083, 4.035, 4.040, and 5.045 on January 25th, 2022. In the state of New Mexico doubles plant limits for cannabis growers. With fewer than 3 months until all adult New Mexicans can legally buy cannabis, the state has raised the limit on the number of plants producers can grow. The new plant count numbers for producers are Level 1, 401 to 2,000 mature cannabis plants. Level 2, 2,001 to 6,000 mature cannabis plants. Level 3, 6,001 to 12,000 mature cannabis plants. Or Level 4, 12,001 to 16,000 mature cannabis plants. A spokeswoman for Ultra Health stated, quote, unfortunately, this increase may be too little too late. Sales to adults will commence in 74 days, and it takes twice as long, 5 months, for cannabis to be fully prepared from seed to sale. We are running a deficit to support 180,000 patients today. So to think this new rule would somehow alter the biological process required to grow cannabis is naive at best, end quote. In New Mexico, the first cannabis retail and manufacturing licenses have been issued. The Cannabis Control Division of the Regulation and Licensing Department Wednesday announced that they had issued the first new cannabis retail and manufacturing license under the Cannabis Regulation Act, creating jobs and bringing the state another step closer to the successful launch of the adult use cannabis sales by April 1st. With 285 submitted applications, not including existing medical licenses, the Cannabis Control Division's professional staff is working with prospective licensees to complete their application and approve licenses. Unlike in some states, there is no limit on the number of cannabis licenses in New Mexico. Applicants who complete the licensing process will receive a license. In Oregon, Curaleaf settles 10 lawsuits related to THC CBD product lines mix-up. Curaleaf has settled 10 lawsuits related to its mix-up last year of THC and CBD tinctures at a Portland, Oregon facility. Additional cases, including a wrongful death suit, are still pending. The MSO, Curaleaf, has already settled 10 lawsuits over CBD drops it sold in Oregon that contain THC. Employees at the company's Portland facility had mixed up the company's THC and CBD select products, which made their way to consumers and prompted a recall by state regulators last September. Curaleaf, which is based in Massachusetts, agreed to a $50,000 payout for Idaho resident Ayaba, an Air Force veteran who said he was taken to the emergency room after using the select CBD tincture. Ayaba is one of 10 settled lawsuits who said, "I want them to be better, and I want the industry to be better, and I want a safer community." Ayaba is right. This real-life scenario shows that technology cannot save you from compliance shortcomings. Learn more in RMCC's Compliance Digest on how to protect your business against these violations caused by human error. In Oregon, the OLCC released a compliance education bulletin providing guidance on comprehensive changes in recreational marijuana rules. On December 28, 2021, the OLCC approved comprehensive changes in rules regulating recreational marijuana licensees. The commission also established standards for regulating hemp products sold in Oregon's general marketplace. The Compliance Education Bulletin, CE 2021-04, covers the following issues: new and updated definitions in Division 25, artificially derived cannabinoids in the non-OLCC marketplace, artificially derived cannabinoids in the OLCC marketplace, packaging and labeling changes, packaging and labeling for artificially derived cannabinoids, recreational and medical marijuana concentrate limits, scoring and labeling, hemp concentration limits in the OLCC marketplace, hemp concentration limits in the non-OLCC marketplace, changes to license privileges, changes to retailer delivery, miscellaneous changes to Division 25, and industrial hemp-derived vapor items and testing and labeling. In Utah enacts new medical cannabis rules to help patients. The Utah Department of Health will accelerate plans to increase patient access to the medical cannabis program and to allow additional healthcare providers to recommend medical cannabis. The Utah legislature passed the LMP program to address a shortage of qualified medical providers during the 2021 session. Under Utah's original medical cannabis framework, such providers were required to go through extensive training and be approved by the DOH, which led to a provider shortage. In Washington, a technical bulletin from LCB, moving forward with CCRS. The Cannabis Central Reporting System, CCRS, is now the sole and official reporting system for cannabis businesses' activity in Washington state. The full transition to CCRS was a two-part process. First, the CCRS was successfully deployed on December 6, 2021. And then the second phase, on the evening of December 19th, the LCB decommissioned Leaf Data Systems. The LCB states that the system is working. While rollouts are always rocky, the state says that the action was successful. Businesses have not been halted, nor has the system been down since the quote go live date. Roughly 3/4 of licenses have transitioned to CCRS, and Each day, more licensees are uploading records into the system. In Washington, a rule change. There's been an updated list of pesticides allowed for use in high THC cannabis production. The Washington State Department of Agriculture has recently updated the list of pesticides that are allowed for use in high THC cannabis production in Washington State, based on the criteria previously established by the WSDA. The WSDA has added 1 new Section 3 pesticide and 5 new Section 25 subsection B pesticides in the list of allowable products for a total of 6 new products. There were no Section 3 pesticides removed from the list. There was 1 Section 25 subsection B pesticide removed from the list. The updated list contains 285 Section 3 pesticides and 104 Section 25 subsection B pesticides for a total of 389 products. In Washington, permanent rules filed regarding evaluating THC compounds. On January 5th, LCB took the following action in approving permanent rules with CR 103, allowing the board to evaluate additives, solvents, ingredients, or compounds used in the production of cannabis products and prohibiting the use of substances determined to pose a risk to the public health or youth access. The framework provides that such prohibition may occur by emergency or permanent rule, providing an additional layer of oversight for substances that may pose a risk to public health or youth access. In New Mexico, lawmakers to consider cannabis legalization changes. New Mexico lawmakers will consider changes to the state's cannabis regulations during a special 30-day session, including production increases for cannabis microbusinesses, bud tender education requirements, and allowing liquor licenses to also obtain cannabis licenses, and allowing some industry sectors to employ 18-year-olds, according to the New Mexico Political Report. The state Cannabis Control Division had announced earlier this week that it planned to work with Governor Grissom and legislators on plant limit increases for microbusinesses as a safeguard for expected shortages once adult use sales begin in April, the report says. Lawmakers will consider a bill to increase those plant counts from 200 to 1,000 mature plants. In Oregon, an informational bulletin from OLCC states new potency limits for marijuana edibles. Beginning April 1st, 2022, recreational consumers will be allowed to purchase marijuana edibles containing up to 100 milligrams of THC in an individual package and up to 10 milligrams of THC per serving. About time, Oregon. Retailers may not sell 100 milligram THC edibles until April 1st, 2022. See OAR 845-026-0210. Compliance Bulletin CE 2021-04 provides guidance on the updated rules, including the approved provisions that doubles the allowable amounts of THC in an individual package and individual serving. The OLCC has received a number of questions about how licensees can bring marijuana edibles to market and be compliant by meeting the new April 1st, 2022 potency limits. To ensure that the state regulators provide consistent guidance to licensees, the OLCC has consulted with the Oregon Health Authority regarding this issue. The OLCC is providing this information bulletin to describe how to facilitate transfers of 100 milligram THC marijuana edibles between licensees prior to April 1st, 2022. There are 3 primary concerns. The first is centered around packaging and labeling. The first question is, when will the OLCC begin reviewing and approving labels for marijuana edibles containing up to 100 milligrams of THC? As of January 1st, 2022, licensees may submit for approval label applications for marijuana edibles that contain up to 100 milligrams of THC in an individual package and 10 milligrams THC per serving. The next question is around testing. When can a license begin having products tested for new marijuana edible potency limits? OLCC says marijuana edibles that are only going to be sold on or after April 1st, 2022 may have compliance testing performed under the new potency limit standards prior to April 1st, 2022. Laboratory licensees should determine and have a clear understanding of what potency standard the marijuana licensee intends the item to be sold under. And the final question, control studies. Does a licensee need a new control study for marijuana edibles that meet the new potency requirements? A control study is not required in order to sell higher potency edibles beginning April 1st, 2022. However, once the OLCC certifies a licensed processor submitted control studies, it qualifies future items made by that processor under the specified standard operating procedure for reduced sampling requirements as described in OAR 333-007-0350 and 0360 and 0440. A licensee may want to obtain a new control study dependent on changes made to an SOP for manufacturing a product allowed under the new potency limits. In some instances, a new control study may be unnecessary where amending an existing certified control study to include a new higher potency variation may be all that's required. In Michigan, the MRA released an advisory bulletin stating that proof of financial responsibility insurance requirements for medical applicants and licensees. On December 22nd, 2021, Governor Whitmore signed Public Act 160 of 2021 and Public Act 161 of 2021, which amends the proof of financial responsibility insurance requirement for applicants and licensees under the MMFLA. Specifically, state law now requires the following. The insurance policy is issued by a licensed insurance company or licensed captive insurance company in this state. The insurance policy does not include a provision relieving an insurer from liability for payment of any claim for which the insured may be held liable under the Act. The insurance policy covers bodily injuries to a qualifying patient, including those caused by the intentional conduct of a licensee or its employee or agent. However, the policy would not have to cover bodily injuries to qualifying patients caused by the licensee or its employee or agent when acting with the intent to harm. The MRA released an additional advisory bulletin that states annual financial statement requirements for fiscal year 2022 for medical facilities and adult use establishments. Public Act 119 of 2021, which took immediate effect on December 7th, 2021, amended Section 701 of the MMFLA. It now requires that licensees of medical marijuana facilities file a financial statement every 3 years, or a shorter time period as determined by the MRA. Rule 20 of the marijuana licensees rule set, R 420.20, remains unchanged and requires marijuana establishments to file an annual financial statement in the time and manner instructed by the MRA. In Ohio, a new technical bulletin on the new Registry support system. The Ohio Medical Marijuana Control has implemented a new registry support system through Bamboo Health that includes frequently asked questions and tutorials related to the Ohio Medical Marijuana Registry. The system also provides comprehensive technical support to all users of the registry. Users experiencing errors or other technical issues accessing the medical marijuana registry. In Ohio, the Board of Pharmacy previously approved changes to the Ohio Administrative Code Rule 3796-8-2-04 that will eliminate the current tiered system distinguishing plant materials based on THC percentage. More recently, the board approved additional changes that will establish the 90-day supply of plant material as 9 ounces, regardless of the THC percentage. Patients diagnosed with a terminal illness will continue to have a 90-day supply limit of 10 ounces of plant material. Here's the breakdown of product IDs approved before or after January 3rd. Let's start with the product IDs approved prior to January 3rd. So number 1, product IDs approved prior to January 3rd will remain active and compliant to use. Number 2, product IDs that follow the tier format are compliant and should not be rejected by a dispensary solely because the tier is still included in the product ID. Number 3, The day supply that corresponds to these IDs will no longer be accurate. Dispensaries will need to follow the updated plant material day supply reference when entering the day supply in their point of sale systems and the patient registry. It is recommended to update this information in the product inventory. Now, product IDs approved on or after January 3rd. Here are 3 things to note. Number 1, items submitted for product ID assignment on or after January 3rd will need to follow the following naming convention to be approved. Please review the recording for the standard naming convention that the Board of Pharmacy is now requiring. Number 2, the day supply for plant material products will need to follow the updated plant material day supply reference. Please see the email for the attachment. And then finally, number 3, there should not be a need to modify product IDs approved prior to January 3rd or register new product IDs to corresponding to the new naming convention because there is no expiration date for an improved product IDs. The board is aware that there may be a short period of time after January 3rd wherein not all dispensaries will be able to effect this change in their point of sale systems. Accordingly, the board encourages dispensaries to review patient plant material purchases made on or after January 3rd when dispensing additional product to ensure the accuracy of the day supply associated with those purchases. If there is a known error in the patient registry wherein the dispensation does not reflect the correct day supply based on the weight of the product, dispensaries should manually calculate the correct day supply and allow the patient to purchase additional product in conformance with the new plant material day supply reference. Again, that reference is attached in the email. In Ohio, advocates fall short of signatures required to force cannabis legalization vote. Ohio cannabis advocates were 13,062 valid signatures short of the 133,000 signatures required to force lawmakers to consider adult use cannabis legalization. The petition seeks to legalize the possession of up to 2.5 ounces of flower and allow 6 plants per adult or 12 per household. Representative Jamie Callender introduced a bill last month to implement the reforms with a 10% cannabis tax. In Ohio, regulators announced dispensary license drawing date. Ohio will soon get 73 new medical cannabis dispensary licenses in addition to the 56 medical dispensaries already licensed to operate in the state. Yesterday, the Ohio Medical Marijuana Control Program announced January 27th as the drawing date for the 73 eligible dispensary license applications. The new dispensary licenses could be even more valuable if new legislation winding through the Ohio General Assembly gets enacted. Last month, the Ohio State Senate passed a cannabis bill that revised the state's medical marijuana law, expands the list of qualifying conditions for medical marijuana, and consolidates regulation into a single agency. And then in South Dakota Supreme Court strikes down voter-approved legal cannabis. At this point, the court's decision to strike down an adult use ballot measure that voters passed in November 2020 amounts to a speed bump. Both advocates and lawmakers have been at work for months drafting separate contingency plans to legalize in the state. In Michigan, stalled statewide changes in Michigan caregiver rules now moving to township zoning fights. This is an article by the Grow-In. 4 months after a protest in Lansing and a heated hearing in the state legislature, efforts to change Michigan's caregiver laws have just moved from the state house to municipalities across the state. Quote, "They're not only coming at us through Lansing, but also through townships," said Amy Carter, a caregiver and advocate, referring to alleged efforts by the Michigan Cannabis Manufacturers Association, MCMA. Quote, "They are trying to get townships to put in restrictions like you have to have 5 acres of land to grow in a township," end quote. Michigan has 28,275 registered caregivers as of last month. Each of these caregivers are allowed to grow up to 12 plants at a time for up to 5 patients, plus themselves, if the caregiver is also a registered patient. Reeling off a list of townships and municipalities across Michigan, Carter charges that MCMA has been providing pre-written ordinances to local officials in an attempt to strangulate caregiver operations through zoning restrictions and requirements for home grow operations to be available for unannounced inspections by local police and fire departments. Last fall, a set of proposed caregiver laws supported by MCMA was proposed in Michigan's House. Those laws would have sharply curtailed the number of patient caregivers could serve while also requiring caregivers to adapt to seed-to-sale tracking and testing requirements commercial growers must follow. Caregivers, who usually grow from home with amateur setups, charged the proposed changes would effectively eliminate the state's caregiver system. However, since last October's heated committee hearing and passage from committee, the proposed legislation seems to have stalled on the House floor. Quote, "We did not win, but they're slowly trying to chip away from us," said George Burko, leader of the Michigan Caregivers Association. Quote, "They were hanging their hat on safety. The stuff caregivers grow is a danger when there's no record of people dying or getting hurt from caregiver medicine," end quote. Burko and other caregivers point to the massive $200 million recall of products tested by Veritas Labs as proof that the testing system isn't actually making commercial produced cannabis any better than caregiver product. North Dakota legalization campaign falls short of signature requirements. The North Dakota campaign to legalize cannabis for adult use in the state failed to collect enough signatures to put the question on midterm ballots, failing 11,664 signatures short on last Saturday's deadline. The group had to collect 31,164 signatures in a one-year time frame limit, but only collected 19,500. And in Ohio medical marijuana CEO suspended for giving out product samples, regulators say. The top executive of a medical marijuana cultivator and processor in Southwest Ohio had his employee license suspended last week after regulators accused him of giving out samples. The Department of Commerce says Ancient Roots CEO David Halley gave away products to visitors at his Wilmington facility that were intended for distribution to dispensaries, according to records obtained by the USA Today Network Ohio Bureau. Ancient Roots opened in 2018 under Ohio's medical cannabis program. The company's licenses are still in effect. Department officials have been investigating since November and said Haley failed to securely store his product and maintain accurate records. For example, the inventory system incorrectly showed that the cannabis given away by Haley was still in the processing facility vault. On a personal note, this example shows how important your inventory systems, record retention, and operating plans are. Just because you are an owner, this does not exclude you from compliantly operating your cannabis business, especially if you're providing samples that is not a retail facility. In the Northeast region, Connecticut approves final social equity rule, starting the clock on the adult use market. The clock is officially ticking towards February 3rd, when the first applications for Connecticut's adult use cannabis market become available, after the state's Social Equity Council approved its technical assistance plan on January 4th. Quote, "Now that the council has approved the technical assistance plan, that starts a 30-day window after which the Department of Consumer Protection will post the applications," said SEC Chair Andrea Comer. Following the application, there will be a period of time for those coming in as a social equity applicant to apply. Shortly thereafter, the lottery process will kick off, end quote. The technical assistance plan was the final component to the state's social equity plan for its emerging adult use cannabis market, meaning applications will be available on February 3rd. In Connecticut, what you need to know about Connecticut's recreational pot licensing process. This was a great article by Jenny Monk. Here are a few of that highlights. Connecticut will soon open its first application windows for a few types of licenses in the emerging recreational cannabis program, the state announced last week. The first application period will open in February on a rolling basis through March. The application window will be 90 days for each of the 14 total licenses and registrations available through the medical and recreational programs. Most license types will be awarded through a lottery system. The state plans to conduct multiple lotteries each year, Department of Consumer Protection spokesman Caitlin Krasalat said. Half of all license types will go to social equity applicants. Social equity status is determined by income and whether the applicant has lived in a disproportionately impacted area. The measure is meant to ensure that the new program benefits those who were most impacted by the war on drugs. Moving on to Delaware. Delaware Adult Use Bill features revised social equity program. A new bill to legalize adult use cannabis has been introduced in Delaware, according to a Delaware Public Radio report. Sponsored by Rep. Ed Ozinski, the latest version of the bill scraps a dedicated fund to help social equity applicants for a, quote, justice reinvestment fund, end quote, which will provide direct aid to communities disproportionately affected by cannabis prohibition. Proceeds of the fund will come from adult use cannabis taxes, according to the report. In Maine, Maine's vibrant caregiver market faces oversaturation and possible new regulations. Maine's cannabis caregivers are facing a tightening marketing burden by the possibility of new state licensing requirements. The state is considering new rules for medical cannabis, which may include a tiered licensing system that differentiates between caregiver businesses based on size. Voters in Maine legalized medical cannabis in 1999 through a ballot measure. About a decade later, the legislature updated its rules for medical cannabis through the Medical Use of Marijuana Act. In part, the new law allowed for medical cannabis caregivers to essentially act like microbusinesses. In New Hampshire House votes to legalize marijuana possession and cultivation. The GOP-controlled New Hampshire House of Representatives on Thursday approved a bill to legalize marijuana possession and personal cultivation for adults. Members passed the legislation sponsored by Rep. Carol McGuire in a 241 to 113 vote. This comes one day after the chamber narrowly rejected a separate, broader legislation proposal that would have regulated commercial production and sales. The approved measure that is now advancing to the Senate will not allow cannabis commerce, but adults 21 and older would be allowed to possess and give away up to 3/4 of an ounce of marijuana and grow up to 6 plants, 3 of which could be mature. The bill is virtually identical to an earlier version that also passed the House under Democratic control in 2020. The previous bill died in the Senate committee. In New Jersey just began accepting applications to grow recreational marijuana. Hundreds started the process. The Murphy administration began accepting applications from cannabis growers, product manufacturers, and testing labs on Wednesday. The first step that will usher in the legitimate marijuana industry New Jersey voters endorsed in a referendum 13 months ago. Within 4 hours of the application portal going live at 9 a.m., 500 people had established accounts, and by the end of business, this grew to 635 new accounts. As for the retail license, the application process will open on March 15th. Currently in the state of New Jersey, 98 out of 40 cities opted into cannabis retail. Opt-ins will increase over time as the retail program rolls out and cities create their local regulations. At the state level, CRC did not establish any licensing caps. However, due to the 25% of New Jersey approving retail commercial cannabis activity at the local level, it is expected to be a very competitive landscape. If you're looking for more information on the New Jersey licensing process, check out our Compliance Digest. Again in New Jersey chooses Metric to supply cannabis traceability system. New Jersey chooses Metric to supply cannabis traceability system. The state's 5-member regulatory commission voted unanimously to approve a 6-year, $390,000 contract with the software provider. With New Jersey, Metric now has contracts in 16 states with legal marijuana programs, plus Washington, D.C. and Guam, and tracks 44% of the current adult use markets, including the largest market, California. In New York Senator files bill to extend marijuana equity benefits to gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. A New York senator filed a bill to make it so that gay, lesbian, and bisexual people can qualify as social equity applicants under the state's marijuana law. Senator Jeremy Coney introduced the legislation last week, shortly after filing a separate bill to include transgender and non-binary people in the Cannabis Social Equity Program. He's also behind other recent marijuana reform proposals related to cannabis business tax benefits and licensing. Coney states, quote, social justice and social equity are embedded throughout the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, and the legislation is designed to uplift historically marginalized groups through the economic opportunities in the cannabis industry, he said. We are committed to working to ensure we are meeting our equity licensing goals so that New York creates the most inclusive cannabis economy in the nation, end quote. And I personally could not agree more. In New York, hundreds of New York municipalities will allow marijuana businesses as opt-out deadline passes. At least 48.8% of New York's municipal governments opted out of permitting adult use cannabis retail by the deadline, with at least 55.5% opting out of consumption sites, according to the Rockefeller Institute tracking as of January 12th. Although roughly half of New York's municipal governments opted out of permitting recreational cannabis stores before a December 31st, 2021 deadline, these opt-outs aren't set in stone. That means new adult use retail opportunities could still open up in the nation's fourth largest state by population, even as aspiring recreational marijuana retailers start making plans for communities that have already opted in. Still, the exact rules surrounding recreational marijuana retail in New York remains unknown. Maine's new proposed medical cannabis rules include caregiver seed-to-sale tracking using paper forms. Maine's Office of Marijuana Policy, OMP, released its proposed new set of rules for the state's medical cannabis program on January 17th. The new rules include new requirements for plant tracking and security, but not mandatory lab testing. The new rules would replace the statutes that have governed medical cannabis in the state since May 10th, 2018. The state previously attempted to update its medical cannabis regulations in early 2021 with new rules about plant tracking and security systems, but the effort was blocked by the legislature, leading to a second effort by OMP to produce new medical guidelines that did not attract the same level of caregiver opposition as the previous proposal. Among the new rules, here are a few things to note. Medical operators must track all plants from cultivation to manufacturing to sale and then submit to the state, unlike the adult use operators who must use metric. As a personal note, if we want to take a page out of Oklahoma's playbook, we know that not having centralized seed-to-sale tracking makes it significantly harder for regulators to be able to oversee the industry. Back to the OMP updates. There will also be additional licensing fees for caregivers and dispensaries, and then more structure around security on the licensed premise. Caregiver cultivators must pay $240 for every 6 mature plants and 12 immature, up to a total of 30 mature plants and 60 immature plants for a total fee of $1,200. Caregivers are still not required to submit their cannabis for lab testing, but they must now indicate whether or not they plan to use lab testing. Employees and owners of medical cannabis operators must be able to prove residency for at least 183 days. And then finally, the state will hold a public comment hearing via Zoom in response to the proposed rules on Wednesday, February 2nd, 2022 at 10 a.m. Eastern. In Massachusetts, the CCC calls for legal correction to allow social consumption rules. The CCC expressed support for licensing social consumption sites for recreational cannabis last week, but called on the state to first fix a legal loophole that prevents them from doing so. The commission voted 4-1 to approve the proposal during a January 20th meeting. In New Jersey, home grow not happening right now, says New Jersey Senate President. New Jersey State Senator Nick Scutari, the Senate president and a major proponent for cannabis legalization, said he doesn't see the home cultivation of cannabis coming anytime soon. Quote, I am not against marijuana being grown at home for medical purposes and maybe even just recreational purposes, but we've got to let this industry. It's not even off the ground yet, Scutari said during his remarks via the press. Of the 19 states that have legalized cannabis, New Jersey is the only one that does not allow medical patients to grow their own, the report says. Cultivating even one cannabis plant in the state is still punishable by up to 5 years in prison and $25,000 fine, despite the state's legalization law. No one should be in jail for a plant. Mississippi Senate passes medical marijuana bill. House vote is next. In just 14 months, Mississippi's medical cannabis legalization push has seen success at the ballot box, defeat in the state Supreme Court, and this week, passage into the Senate. The Mississippi State Senate on Thursday passed a medical marijuana law, sending it to the House of Representatives, where approval is less certain. The legislation action came more than a year after voters soundly approved a legislation initiative at the ballot box, only to see the state Supreme Court void the measure on a technical issue. Here are some key business elements to the proposed Senate Bill 2095, the Mississippi Medical Cannabis Act of 2022, according to Mississippi Today. Patients could purchase up to 3.5 ounces of marijuana a month. That's slightly lower than a 5 ounce a month in the 2020 referendum. Cultivation would be indoor only. There would be 6 cultivation tiers, ranging from a micro cultivator capped at 1,000 square feet to a tier 6 grower of 100,000 square feet or more. Roughly 25 patient conditions would qualify, including all 22 that were in Initiative 65. A seed-to-sale tracking system would be created, and the proposed law calls for criminal penalties for violations. And then finally, a 5% excise tax would be imposed for cultivation in addition to the state sales tax, which is currently at 7% for retail sales. In Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Medical Marijuana Authority delays portal launch. OMMA, or OMA, as Oklahomans like to call it, has delayed their licensing portal opening. The launch of OMA's new licensing portal is delayed until Monday, January 24th, after discovering a data migration issue earlier Monday. Officials said that they were unable to accept new license and renewal applications until the new portal launches. Patient and business licenses with an expiration date between January 10th to the 24th are considered valid through January 31st, 2022. In Mississippi, the House passes revised medical cannabis bill. The Mississippi House passed a Senate-approved medical cannabis bill, but with updates adding some qualifying conditions and reducing the amount of medical cannabis that patients can purchase each day. The bill, which passed the House 104-14, moves back to the Senate for final legislative approval before heading to the governor. An Oklahoma bill would pause further medical cannabis licensing. Looking to combat illegal cannabis grows, Oklahoma lawmakers have introduced a bill to pause new medical cannabis licensing while the industry shores up compliance issues. A bill proposed in Oklahoma would put a pause on medical cannabis licensing and allow regulators to implement moratoriums as they deem necessary, the Tulsa World reports. State Rep. Rusty Cornell, the bill sponsors, said that the legislation is needed as the state, quote, has seen a huge number of commercial medical marijuana grows and the facilities flooding, end quote, into Oklahoma communities. Under the state's medical cannabis law, the OMMA has no authority to inspect businesses before issuing a license, which is absurd. Last October, OMA Director Barry indicated that the agency would renew its focus on compliance checks and public safety. Less than 40% of Oklahoma's 8,857 growers and 2,415 processors have been inspected since Oklahoma passed Question 788 in 2018. In addition, an article from KFOR.com in Oklahoma City, one processor states 90% of their product was failing inspection. 1440 Processing explains that a lot of marijuana coming to them from marijuana growers fails to meet industry standards due to high levels of pesticides, heavy metals, and other dangerous chemicals. It's needless to say, Oklahoma needs to get a grip on their industry. Currently, the state has no seed to sale tracking system due to a lawsuit by businesses that claim the system would allow a single private business monopoly. In my opinion, centralized seed to sale tracking is a must for consumer safety and product recall tracking. In South Carolina medical cannabis bill sets for hearing the week of January 24th. A bill to legalize medical cannabis in South Carolina is scheduled for a hearing in the state Senate, according to the Associated Press. The bill, sponsored by Senator Tom Davis, has been introduced for several years in a row, but this is the first time it will receive a hearing. Under the proposal, patients will only be allowed to purchase medical cannabis oil, not smokable flower products. Qualifying conditions would include cancer, multiple sclerosis, glaucoma, sickle cell anemia, and autism. Medical cannabis authorization appointments would be in person only, the report says. Several states in play to legalize marijuana this year through legislation. So this article comes out of the MJ Biz Daily, and lawmakers in several states are expected to legalize either recreational or medical cannabis. The Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states are in the spotlight for adult use marijuana legislative activity, with Rhode Island the top candidate to approve a regulated commercial market, according to industry experts. Maryland lawmakers are expected to refer an adult use legalization initiative to voters. Medical marijuana legalization is expected in Mississippi, where the state's high court nixed a voter-approved referendum last May. Lawmakers in North and South Carolina also have a solid chance of legalizing medical cannabis, experts say. And Connecticut just announced it would begin taking applications for certain types of licensees next month. See a full report and status of each one of these states at mjbizdaily.com. Cannabis growers make first harvest for research purposes, ending federal monopoly. Two companies announced they have harvested cannabis for research purposes in the U.S., ending a 50-year federal monopoly of the practice, Marijuana Moment reports. Previously, cannabis was only allowed to be grown for research purposes at the University of Mississippi, and the available product has long been decried for its low quality and minimum research potential. Congressional Democrats plan to take up cannabis reforms in spring. Congressional Democrats are planning to take up cannabis-related issues in the spring, including proposals to allow the industry access to banking, expunging criminal records, and potentially decriminalization, the Hill reports. Notably, the House of Representatives has voted 5 times since 2019 to approve the Safe Banking Act, which would give cannabis companies access to traditional financial services, but the legislation has never been taken up by the Senate. The MORE Act, which would remove cannabis from the federal schedule of controlled substances and expunge federal convictions, was also approved by the lower chamber, but not considered by the Senate, which is now controlled 50-50 with Vice President Kamala Harris serving as the tie-breaking vote. A great article out of Bloomberg Law. Flaws in federal cannabis bills threaten the legal market. Cannabis is gaining acceptance, with more than 36 states and territories have legalized the plant in some form. Cannabis reform has widespread support nationally, with a recent Pew Research Center poll showing that 91% of Americans support legal recreational or medical marijuana use. Here are a few items that need to be addressed in the article by Shailene Title and Andrew Klein. 1, must address dormant commercial clause. What is the DCC? In short, it's a legal doctrine that bars states from enacting policies that discriminate against interstate commerce. Because of the federal prohibition of cannabis, many states have ignored the doctrine and adopted regulatory programs that serve to benefit and promote the growth of local cannabis businesses. Without specific congressional action to pause the DCC after federal legalization, many critical state regulations and social equity programs that current businesses and licensees rely upon will become void overnight. Number 2, Congress must act to avoid patchwork of state laws. Congress must clearly outline the balances of powers between state and federal regulators, or it risks years of litigations and headaches. Within the article, the authors state, look at the way Congress descheduled hemp and its derivatives, namely CBD, leaving a patchwork of state laws and regulatory chaos in its wake. Customers have no reliable information on purity or any guarantee of truth in labeling, while hemp-derived cannabinoids are sold at gas stations without proper product testing or age verification. From my personal experience, here are a few additional operational items to consider with federal legalization and the potential standardization at the federal level. First, supply chain structure. How does retail versus delivery versus on-site consumption work? How does distribution versus transportation work? As we know, in California, Nevada, Michigan, Colorado, Massachusetts, there are transporters, there are distributors, and there are specific requirements while transporting cannabis, or you can even receive cannabis from B2B businesses. This will play a huge impact in the overall standardization of the supply chains nationwide. Second, packaging and labeling standardization. If the federal government regulates this requirement, we may see that states with more flexible packaging and labeling requirements end up becoming more stringent due to federal legalization. Third thing to consider, tax structure. And then fourth, of course, traceability. All of these items will need to be considered for federal legalization and overall standardization. Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace is on the mission to legalize cannabis. And guess what? Amazon just got behind her. In November, the 44-year-old freshman Congresswoman, who represents South Carolina's coastal swing district spanning Charleston to Hilton Head, introduced the States Reform Act, a bill that would end the federal government's 85-year prohibition on marijuana. Mace is certainly not the first politician to introduce a cannabis legalization bill, although it's been impossible to get one passed by both chambers of Congress. But Mace already has one of the most powerful conservative groups in the world in her corner, Charles Koch's American for Prosperity. And now she has one of the world's largest companies supporting her bill, Amazon. Mace's States Reform Act would remove cannabis from the Controlled Substance Act and regulate it like alcohol. The federal government would impose a nationwide 21-year age limit for cannabis consumption, with an exception for medical use. The bill would also allow for states to make up their own rules and laws around cannabis, including banning sales and use within state borders.